Hello and welcome back to Understanding Pliosaurs with Dr. Judyth Sassoon. Welcome to episode 4, Are Pliosaurs an Evolutionary Anomaly? This series is sponsored by the Ruskin Mill Trust, who are an educational charity that operates in England, Scotland and Wales. They offer exciting outdoor learning environments and utilise practical land and craft activities to support the development of work and life skills in young people with autism and other learning difficulties. I will be your host, Ash Hall. For this series, I'm joined by Dr. Judyth Sassoon, paleobiologist and pliosaur expert from Bristol University.
Hi again, Ash.
In the last few episodes, we've been learning about the makeup of the pliosaur, its anatomy, its skeleton, what a pliosaur actually is. Of everything we've covered so far, some things appear to make it quite unique. Other features exhibit things we might expect from a marine animal. Make sure to check out those previous episodes if you haven't already. One thing we have discussed is how difficult this animal is to understand. So, from what we've discovered so far, Judith, what makes the pliosaur so special?
So yes, I think that what we need to consider here is how do they strike the public? Let's say on a museum display when you have a reconstruction of a pliosaur, what is it that people notice about it? And I would say that the sort of key features would be the size of the head, maybe the teeth, the size of the teeth, the four fins, which are a very peculiar feature of both pliosaurs and plesiosaurs, and in the sort of later pliosaurs and the later Jurassic pliosaurs, the sheer size of them. So those would be the striking features that people would possibly consider. The pliosaurs are odd in a way. I mean, they are related to the plesiosaurs. Of course, there's the plesiosaurians as a group, contain both plesiosaurs and pliosaurs. They have very similar body plan in terms of their four fins. But the plesiosaurs have a certain romance about them. And that's to do with the fact that they've got this extremely long neck, or many of them have. So once the plesiosaurs were discovered in the 1820s, they became popular very quickly because they could be identified, as romantic sea serpent-like sea monsters. And this is seen in the way that they were represented in what's called paleo art, the art of reconstructing these fossils as living creatures in art. Now the pliosaurs, which were known from a little bit later, they were already they were suspected in the 1820s, but they became known later. They weren't represented very much in paleo art for a very, very long time, and it's only in recent times that they've become much more popular as creatures, as reconstructed creatures. And this is rather strange, and I sort of suspect it's because they don't quite look as romantic as plesiosaurs. But nevertheless, what does strike you is that they've got a big head, they've got these four fins, and that they can be extremely large. Now, if one looks at the head, and this is more striking in the pliosaurs because you can see their heads because they're big. One thing that you see that they're quite they have openings. So you see in our one here, the models in front of me, you see its nasal openings just there. So that's one set of openings that it has. You see its eyes just there. And you also see these great big openings at the back, which are the temporal fenestrae, and the muscles of the jaw thread through these large openings here. And they strike people too, who are looking at the exhibit here. People often sort of comment on these things. So the skull is very odd. It's this triangular, perforated structure and large. And the teeth, of course, are often commented on too. They are the typical teeth of a macropredator, and they can give the pliosaur the impression of being scary.
That's very true. They do certainly intimidate you. So, before we go any further, this episode's about what makes them special. but I feel it's necessary to possibly get some of the very obvious things, like why they might not be special, out of the way.
Okay.
So similarities with other animals. Obviously, as I mentioned, there are things about them which are similar to other marine animals. There's going to be, as some might call them, some forms of convergent evolution between them, like crocodiles and other marine animals. So, is there anything very briefly that we should expect to see on a pliosaur that marine environments dictate?
Yes. So here we need to perhaps consider more carefully what it means to be, what convergence means in evolutionary terms. And we should also start to understand what it means to be secondarily marine. So first of all, the pliosaurs are secondarily marine creatures. Like plesiosaurs, like whales, like seals and otters and other such mammals as well. So to be secondarily aquatic or secondarily marine means that during the evolutionary trajectory, this animal, this group, have made a U-turn from land back to the sea. Now, why do I say back to the sea? Because in the late Devonian, there was the first evolutionary transition of vertebrate animals onto land. So the first animals that had skeletons that came onto land, they were called tetrapods. Why? Because they have 4 legs and they have fingers and so on. So they are tetrapods. And this group of tetrapods, from this group, we have the common ancestor of all current or all extant reptiles, mammals, and birds. And indeed, all the extinct tetrapods, such as dinosaurs, marine reptiles, and so on. So these were land animals. The common ancestor of all these animals was a land terrestrial creature. Now, from this ancestral tetrapod, we have the lineages evolving. And from these lineages, from birds, from reptiles, from mammals, some groups returned to water. So from the mammals we know about whales and the seals and the otters and also the sirenians, the dugongs and manatees. All of these animals, they returned, they're secondarily aquatic, they're secondarily marine in some cases. In the case of the marine reptiles, this is similar. So they are reptiles that were terrestrial ancestrally, and they returned to water. Now, what is interesting is that with these animals that independently make the evolutionary step back to water, is that they take on a shape, not surprisingly, which enables them to live and hunt and survive in water. And there are essentially 2 features that are required for that. One is streamlining, and the other is some means of moving through the water. And there's different means of moving through water which animals have adopted. But as you well know, amongst the animals that we've mentioned, they are often adopt fin-like structures. So we go from feet on land to fins independently. So we can say that the fins of whales, the fins of pliosaurs, and the fins of turtles are convergent. Their common ancestor didn't have such things, but these animals have independently developed these structures for motion through water. And the other way in which these animals converge, but in slightly varying ways, is to achieve some form of streamlining. The very obvious example of that are the ichthyosaurs and the whales and dolphins, which adopt a sort of rather fish-like body plan. The plesiosaurs and pliosaurs, they're streamlined in different ways from the ichthyosaurs, but nevertheless streamlining in the ways that we've discussed are a feature of animals that have returned to water.
Wonderful. And the reason I wanted to bring up those kind of similarities is because one of them leads into one of the very specific things that I find quite unique about pliosaurs, and it's that fin layout. And if you look at the analogues of today with turtles, whales, dolphins, sharks, the front limbs or those pectoral fins, from what I see, are bigger than their rear limbs and anal fins. So proportionally, what I'm used to seeing are the bigger front fins, flippers, than the rear. So that's what I would picture when you see a pliosaur. I'd naturally assume that those would be bigger at the front and smaller at the back. But with pliosaurs, it's the other way around.
Yes, in the large pliosaurs, it's quite clear that the hind legs, the hind limbs, are larger than the forelimbs. So the femur the femora of the pliosaurs are longer than the humeri. This is different in plesiosaurs, actually. In plesiosaurs, it's the front limbs that are slightly bigger in some cases. And in some cases, I think amongst the Romaleosaurs, they're pretty much equal, although the Romaleosaur experts might disagree with that. But in pliosaurs, it is the hind limbs that are larger. Now, this isn't very surprising. If you think there are some animals, I mean, actually amongst seals, weirdly, if you look at you might not see this if you're looking at a seal on a beach, but if you look at the skeleton of a seal, the hind legs are actually longer than the forelegs. And if you look at the movements of seals in water, they are actually using their hind quarters to move through the water to give them the power, and they seem to be stabilizing their movements and changing direction with the forelimbs. So this could be what was going on here with the pliosaurs, that their sort of the propulsion was going on from the back, and that the forelimbs were acting as direction changers or sort of some stabilizers. We don't know very much about the motion of pliosaurs. We've speculated on it, and it's still something that is being actively researched by colleagues in different places like Imperial College and so on.
My thoughts on this are that it's, quite fascinating, because as much as you mentioned an example of the seal, still in my head, what I've seen in extant life is they tend to be that front driven once they enter the water. However, if you look on land, the rear legs are always bigger.
Not always,
Well,
but a lot of the time. Yes,
So
in some animals, yes.
Dogs,
yes.
horses, most mammals, rear legs are bigger. Even humans, upright animals, the legs are bigger than the arms. So, in a sense, I can see why, if it's come from a land-based ancestor, that you might still have those rear flippers larger proportionally, but then that would be awkward within the lineages from plesiosaurs, I suppose.
Yeah, so this is another convergence, I would say, if you want to put it like that, because the ancestral pliosaurs were much more plesiosauromorph in their body plan, so their rear limbs perhaps were not quite as big. But obviously, for some reason, the large size possibly demanded it. I don't know. Perhaps the hunting style demanded it. Yeah.
Fair enough. Or, now hear me out, this is going to be wild. Or there's a completely different ancestral lineage from land to water for pliosaurs where they just kept the rear limbs.
That's unlikely, because I think you need to consider what's going on in the whole sort of Sauropterygian lineage then. I think we're going to be talking about that evolutionary step next week, next time. So perhaps we should leave it till then, but it would be, I would say, extremely unlikely, and for a very large number of reasons why that would be the case.
Well, that is, complicated, but it does open a lot of questions, which I hope to explore with you. There are a couple more features that I have in mind about the uniqueness of these animals. One of them we've touched on before, the BBC touched upon it in its documentary, but it feels necessary to touch upon here because I simply don't know enough about how unique it is, I suppose. And that would be the parietal eye. Do plesiosaurs have them as well?
Yes, they do. So the parietal eye is that structure just there. It's this perforation, or this extra third eye, which is found in the sort of between the parietal bones of these animals. In what we know about these structures, so there are animals, extant animals, that retain them. So there are parietal or pineal eyes, sometimes they're called, in fish. They exist also in certain lizards, and they exist in amphibians, some amphibians, certainly amphibians of the past. And so what these seem to be is they're light-sensitive structures. They possibly are also thermoregulatory structures. And although they don't have the sort of light sensitivity of our normal eyes, as it were, our lens eyes, they are able to detect changes in light. So they might be seasonal detectors. They seem to, in extant animals, detect changes in season, in sort of breeding patterns are affected by these structures. So that's something that might have been going on in the pliosaurs too. They might also have been there to help orientate the pliosaur when it's swimming, sort of to know which way is up and down, although there may have been other ways that it could do that too. So no, that's not. I mean, it depends on what you mean by unique, but it's not a unique structure. It is one of the features that is shared by plesiosaurs and pliosaurs.
Is it something that is unique on an animal that size? In this context, top of the food chain predator, is it something that you wouldn't usually see?
I think mosasaurs had them. So mosasaurs are also rather large. But we don't have anything that large today that has them now.
So I suppose it's a sort of unexpected from a general public point of view. You wouldn't. I suppose that's why it captured the imagination with the BBC. The idea of this third eye. It's not something you'd expect, but it's not necessarily unique. Would be a way of viewing that.
Yes.
So while we're talking about touching upon the senses, another one of those sorts of things that really captured people's imagination is this idea of the foramina. Is that something unique in an animal like this?
Yeah, so the foramina, I expect what you mean by those are there are little openings around the snout and further back as well along the maxilla, which is I'm just pointing to here, and also along the lower jaw. And people notice these, they often comment on these, they wonder what they are. Now, when you have structures like that, these foramina, they are probably channels for the neurovascular system. So neurovascular system means the nerves and the blood vessels. They're ways that the channels for the nerves and the blood vessels to sort of push through. And that does suggest, if you have a lot of these channels on your snout, it is suggesting that something's going on there, that there is a sensitivity there, that there is a need for a blood supply to go on there. So there may be two things that we have to think about here. One is the sensitivity. So what that could be, because we can compare this to certain structures in crocodiles, there could be a mechanosensory system, which pliosaurs would be sort of sharing with things like crocodiles. And that would mean that there would be nerve channels opening up into the snout, and that the snout would be able to detect maybe changes in the water and vibrations. So it would be a way of detecting prey, perhaps. The other thing to consider is that the teeth require quite a large blood supply. When we CT scanned the snout of the Dorchester pliosaur, we did actually find that the system branches very intensely inside the snout. And these are probably branches from the trigeminal nerves, so it suggests that there are branches from both the nerves and the blood vessels going on there. But just going back to the teeth, so the pliosaur have teeth that are constantly they're constantly being replaced. So the larger teeth are falling out and the little teeth pushing through and immediately replacing them. This is unlike in mammals where teeth are replaced only once in the lifetime. Here we have a continuous replacement. Now, if that's going to happen, you need a big blood supply to that. So it's not surprising that we have a blood supply going to the snout and all down the jaw. And similarly, one would probably expect that some kind of nervous sensitivity is needed there. Though I don't really know how that could happen. If one loses teeth, one imagines that might hurt. So I don't really know how that works. But a sort of heavy blood supply to the teeth would be needed for this continuous replacement, I'm sure.
Interesting. So, in terms of how we'd compare that to what we know in the world around us, crocodiles are the best comparison for those sorts of foramina, aren't they?
Yes, I mean, we have foramina. All bones contain foramina of various sorts to allow blood vessels and nerves through them in different places. But such an intense concentration of them, it would suggest something quite significant going on. And crocodiles do have some sort of rather similar structures, I understand. Yeah.
Okay. You touched upon teeth there. One of the things that I think are quite unique, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I do not know of any other animals that have adopted the trihedral tooth shape.
Yeah, so this seems to be a fairly sort of characteristic feature of the late Jurassic Pliosaurus genus. Not all pliosaurs have these trihedral teeth. The brachiocanine pliosaurs don't. They have sort of round but still equally sharp teeth. And the earlier pliosaurs also didn't have such large trihedral teeth that we find in these late Kimmeridgian pliosaurs. So they are clearly cutting teeth. They are macropredaceous teeth. These things we can certainly see. And that trihedral shape is retained throughout the tooth row. So we find it both in the very large caniniform teeth, the canines, which are in the sort of premaxillary and the sort of early maxillary region, whereas the later teeth, the teeth going further back, they're also trihedral, but they have a slightly more ratchet shape than the caniniform teeth. But it is interesting that trihedral shape is seen throughout the tooth row of the genus Pliosaurus. It is one of its features, but it's not a unique feature of all pliosaurs.
No, so just unique of the Pliosaurus genus. Yeah, very interesting. I'm going to go off script with this next one.
Mm-hmm.
So, going back to senses, Judith, we have a very large animal. But if I look at it from this angle, like head on, one of the things that seems to be missing from the snout, where you have all these foramina, and based on most other animals that we have in the collection, the nostrils aren't at the end of the nose. They're further back.
No, they're not.
Is that a unique feature?
What is interesting about that, and this was commented on by Mike Taylor already in the 1980s, if you turn the skull upside down, you should find also something called internal nostrils along the palatal region. And you would expect that the internal nostrils would be further back than the external nostrils, for the reason that you would expect that nostrils are there for smelling. So it would sort of smell through the water, it would take water in through its external nostrils and into its mouth through the internal nostrils. But it seems that the internal nostrils are in fact further forward than the external nostrils. So that would, one would then propose or think that possibly what this animal is doing is it's opening its mouth and actually sort of tasting the water through its mouth and allowing the current to run through its internal nostrils first and then out through its external nostrils, and somehow sensing it like that. So you're quite right. The position of the nostrils is strange if you think about it relative to what's going on inside the palate.
I'm curious. See, the issue I have with, well, listening to what you say there, two thoughts come to mind. One is, if you're opening your mouth and you're attacking a large animal, you're going to have a huge amount of water flowing in your... So having some form of outlet would make sense, I suppose, if it can go in and leave.
Yes.
But the contradictory side of that is they're right in front of the eyes, so they're not going to be forcing pressured water straight into their eye.
Perhaps that's not what happens. I don't know. There could be some sort of soft tissue thing going on. Maybe the nostrils are just closed up once the attack happens. I really don't know.
No, it's just one of those things that I can't quite get my head around with that nostril position. But yeah, so you mentioned the foramina being an intensely sensitive blood-flowed area. So if we look at the blood of these animals, obviously we don't have any, we can't fossilise blood, so it's very much up to interpretation from the evidence we have. But these were presumably warm-blooded based on what we know, or cold-blooded?
Yeah, so that's again one of those disputable points. There is some evidence to suggest that they might have evolved a warm-blooded state. Why? Because the histological analysis of bone, of Sauropterygian bone perhaps, or at least plesiosaurs and pliosaurs, suggests that they might have grown very fast. And a fast-growing animal suggests warm-bloodedness. Also, if you're thinking about the kind of predatory lifestyle which we're inferring for these animals, a sort of constant warm-blooded state would perhaps be better for the kind of lifestyle that they are thinking of or that they're trying to lead. But of course, sharks are not warm-blooded, and they are predators as well. So it's one of those discussion points. But I think the evidence from the bone histology is probably the best one to go by at the moment.
So this idea that they could be warm-blooded is a complicated one, but it wouldn't be a unique thing within a large reptile to see that.
We're discussing the same thing with dinosaurs, whether they were warm-blooded or not. There seems to be some evidence to suggest that certainly the large theropods might have been.
Yeah, I think that's pretty much everything I have to query you about when it comes to what makes these animals special. They've
certainly sort of in recent times captured the public attention, I think largely because suddenly we are able to visualize them in the way that our displays are showing large skulls. In Britain alone we've got two on display now, really large ones, one in Dorchester, one here in the Etches collection. There are others in collections in drawers. There is also a very, very large jaw on display in Oxford. So it's starting to become, and of course they're being more represented in the artist, in the paleo art. Yeah. So they are capturing the imagination, and they may be becoming as romantic as plesiosaurs in sort of modern times as they were not in the sort of late 19th century.
From what I'm gathering from this discussion then, we've got these animals that, as you said, are becoming more and more romanticised within pop culture, which is something we will explore further in a much later episode. I think it might be our last episode actually, but we will get to that. But from our perspective, and in terms of their existence, they didn't appear so unique within a Mesozoic context because the surroundings of the animals, as we've mentioned, there were some variously similar features. The nostrils were similar to ichthyosaurs, the flippers were similar to plesiosaurs, the possible warm-bloodedness would have been logical with dinosaurs. it's only one genus that appear to have these specifically unique teeth. So in terms of that side of things, they are actually quite fitting for their time period. But from a perspective of today's life, looking back, they do appear to be quite this unique animal that has many reasons to capture our imagination, because they just can't be pictured with what we know today. Is that fair to say?
I think if we encountered one swimming around, we'd find it odd. Quite apart from the fact that it's quite scary if it's large, but we would probably be mesmerised by it, yes.
Brilliant. Well, that's probably the best point to end this one. So I will wrap this up. Next time, we will be discussing Pliosaur evolution and extinction. You've been watching and listening to Understanding Pliosaurs with Dr. Judyth Sassoon. Thank you, and see you next time.
Thank you very much.